right, haters, it's time for another episode of I Hate Real Estate. Since I'm not famous yet, I'm still going to hang out with you and do this podcast. How are you doing,
You
Kendall?
can get somebody different one day.
No, never. If I was famous, I would need you more than I need you now.
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I got an interesting call from our friends at the Real Estate Commission the other day. I haven't told you about this. And it's fine, but it's just when the Real Estate Commission calls you, you're like, yes? Of course I was sitting behind my desk reading a contract. How can I help you? And this guy's like, well, not a big issue, Jamie. I know you recently have your license moved over to iRealty Arkansas and blah, blah, blah. Point is, had some old signs in a lot way out in Saline County. And it had been like 2-3 days since the process took place. But one of my good friends in the real estate industry felt it necessary to call the Real Estate Commission and notify them that my sign still said Bluebird, but that I didn't work, under the brokerage that I previously owned. So I drove out there after work at 7 p.m. and I picked him up to make sure I didn't offend anybody with those signs. But I got to say,
what a horrible thing to do.
What an asshole. Sorry, but just who does that?
I don't know.
So
I presume the phone number on the sign is still yours.
Yes, and the other part is I'm still the same agent. And the funny part is when you transfer your license, there's all kind of things you have to do, and it takes a little time. You got to move MLS, you got to get new signs, you got to rebrand. For me, it was easy because I went straight back home, so iRealty Arkansas kind of fit with me anyways. But my point is, to just call me. Just call me and be like, hey, we're in the same industry. If I was in the situation, I would hate it if somebody did that to me. So these two signs probably need to be picked up. But
call the commission about it.
Just find something else. There is nothing else to find is why. So whatever. Anyway, that's how my week started. Call me instead of them.
That's right.
However, I did go get the signs. So
You want me to get her?
No, not yet. I like how you presumed immediately it was a female. It could have been a male. We don't know. So anyways, moving on. It made me think about...
Was it a female?
Probably. Yes, it was. That's not the point. Point is I picked up the signs. So that being said, though, it made me think about some FAQs because one of the big beliefs I have about the real estate industry, one of the inspirations behind the title, I Hate Real Estate, came from the lack of what I want to call co-opetition in the market. Okay, there's competition, there's co-opetition. These are two different things. Co-opetition is when you have a little bit of healthy competition in there, but you're cooperating with other brokers in the market to make sure that at the end of the day, we're doing what? Promoting and maintaining the public's trust and having these great real estate transactions go down that are nothing like you see on HGTV. But there's a lot of lack of communication and cooperation when you bring in the competition element. I'm also a rapper. So Speaking to that, I'm sure you've seen some arguments between agents over the years. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of things people don't know about how we do things in Arkansas. So I wore my cool boots. We're going to talk about some Arkansas rules. First one on the plate today is buyer commission paid by. And also let's start with, what is a buyer's agent called in Arkansas?
Seller's agent.
Isn't that great? So the first thing you need to know when you sign a contract as a buyer is that you're going to sign under a section that says seller's agent.
Mm-hmm. It's stupid.
It's dumb.
We've talked about it before. It's really dumb.
We have referred to episode whatever that is, but
we shall not call it the seller's agent.
No, we're not. For the purposes of this show, a buyer's agent will be a buyer's agent. And in the state of Arkansas, there are a lot of interesting and exciting things to be considered as a buyer, right?
Yes.
Some of those things are found in the contract automatically, but one of the biggest things is the buyer's commission is normally paid by
seller.
Talk to me about that.
It's just the way it is.
Tell me how it
happened. There's an understood pattern and practice that is part of negotiation of a standard form contract on the Arkansas Realtors Association form contract that the buyer's commission that would be paid to the buyer's agent will be paid by the seller at closing.
So if you're coming in from another state, it doesn't even cost you any money.
That's correct. So whatever you sign off, if you sign off on a 5% commission to sell your house as a listing, as you're selling your house, you're not going to pay an additional fee. You're going to pay 5%. And that basically what's happening in reality is that buyer's agent is getting a portion of the 5% that your listing agent would get. And they work out that deal amongst them as to what that split is. It's usually on the contract on the front end in whatever listing agreement that you sign with the agent. It will list out, here's the commission. If a lot of agents will do like 6% or so, and then if I get both sides of it, we'll do it for a net 5. But if it's 6 and some other agent brings a buyer, then it'll be like a 3.6, 2.4 split, something like that.
Yeah, those sound like pretty fair numbers. But it's interesting because when I first got into real estate, I thought that the seller actually had to pay 6% and then there was an additional percentage that got paid to the buyer's agent. When I figured out that the cards are all in the seller's hand, at first I thought that's a little unfair. Like they're the one who's having to pay another agent to bring somebody in. But that it's also why the cooperation is so important in our market, because you're immediately in co-brokerage agreement almost every single time that you sell a house, because you list it and then you're advertising what you're selling what you're going to pay the buyer's agent when you close. And so that brings up another issue. Like when you have an advertised percentage that you're saying in the MLS, I'm going to pay you 2.4% as a buyer's agent. Buyer's agents can be motivated by that, because sometimes you'll put it in at 3% or maybe down at 2%. And I've actually had agents before call me and be like, it's only 2% in the MLS. Like, are you sure it's not 2.4? It's like, yeah, I'm sure. But also that shouldn't change your ability to show the property if you're being fair, right?
Yeah.
Is there any rules or laws about that?
Not that I know of.
Okay. I was just making sure, because
I thought you were about to go, well, here's one.
No. There are some rules about, I noticed you didn't peg yourself to, it's always 6%. You said it's 6% or so.
Yes. And the problem with what you just said, too, about an agent calling you and saying, are you sure it's not 2.4? It's listed as 2 in the MLS, is there are rules and regs regarding what can be put in the MLS and the accuracy of those claims in the MLS. I know that the Realtors Association Ethics Committee, they take a great interest in the MLS being 100% as accurate as it can be.
Mm-hmm. Well, it needs to be, but one of the things that was the reason why I brought it up, though, was because that call in particular was in a different, so geographically competent, but I was a little bit outside my normal scope as far as where I was listing property. And in that particular region, the girl called and was just like, well, out here, this is how we do it at our MLS. I'm like, well, good for you. This is how much money I have to spare in the deal. So that's what's on the table. And that's one of those situations where you really can't price fix, though, as far as like there is a rule about disclosure when it comes to percentages and what you're charging and stuff like that. You can't.
Yeah, you can't pre-negotiate things as far as price fixing. You can't agree with other persons in the industry about what certain amounts are going to be on the front end to the detriment of whoever the listing party would be, the seller would be.
Yeah. And what's interesting about it too is just for me, if you're coming in from out of state and you're working with a real estate agent, you're not even going to pay for the property that you buy. So that's why you need to be super duper careful about what agent you choose, because not only are they going to make money off of you, but if they don't advise you properly and you're coming in from a different area and you don't have geographical competence in the market in which you're putting your dollars to work, that's the problem.
Well, and price fixing is not just about price either. It's about anti-competition. So there's both the fixing of a price, but in and of itself is anti-competitive. If the parties are each fixing a price, then they're not bidding against themselves. They're not trying to see who the person is that can provide the best deal. So it goes hand in hand. The best example of this in real estate that I know of is a situation where, let's say that you said that an empty lot gets sold to a contractor that's building a house on the lot. And that lot is listed by an agent. If that agent attaches a contingency for that contractor that, hey, is this a spec house or a pre-sold? And the contractor says, well, this is a spec house, I'm going to list it on the market. And the agent says, well, I'll sell you this listing, but it has to be contingent that when you sell the spec house, you list it with us. That is absolutely 100% price fixing in Arkansas. It is a violation of every price fixing act.
Obviously, a title company cool enough to sponsor a show like this one knows what they're doing. So it's time for you to handle your business and bring your deal to the table at American Abstract Title Company here in Central Arkansas. I'm Jamie Taylor, host of I Hate Real Estate. If you need more information on where to close that deal, click the link below to connect with American Abstract and Title Company. Now, back to the show.
And law that's out there.
You better watch it. Be careful.
I mean, it's criminal.
I can't imagine. Well, I just can't even imagine putting myself in that situation. But you have to get well versed.
I've run into it 3 times in the last 5 years.
Really?
With one company.
Oh, see how this happens?
Out in
Chenal. Oh, we're getting closer.
They need to stop.
Yeah, well, they need to be careful, because the big thing is that changes things in the market for participants. And our job as agents, brokers, appraisers, attorneys is to promote and maintain that public trust, going back to square one.
Eventually, some contractor is going to get pissed off enough.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a lot of our contractors here have finally gotten to the point where some of them just get licenses and they're responsible for selling and brokering their own deals because they don't want to get involved with agents who are doing things like that.
Yeah. And you're talking about some major
it's a lot of money.
Price homes out there. I mean, we're not talking $150,000 houses,
which for the record is closer to our median home price for those of you wanting to buy from out of state.
Area, you're talking four to 600,000 minimum.
Yeah, no, you can't keep them at 600,000 in one of these subdivisions over here. They're just flying off the market at 620, 640. It's crazy.
So we're talking a lot of money.
Yeah,
from a commission standpoint.
Yeah, so be aware out there as far as when you're working with the buyer if you're coming from out of state. Also, buyers agents, listing agents, be aware of how the commission's paid and why you're paying it. Make sure that you are getting what you paid for on the other side, which is the other agent cooperating and following all the guidelines and rules that are set before us by the commission, who you shouldn't call when you're signing. It's 2 days. Anyways, I'm not sore about that. No. Moving on. What does it mean that Arkansas is technically a non-disclosure state?
It means if you're not required by a contract or other agreement to disclose the condition or some known fact about your property, you do not have to. It's not illegal to withhold that information.
Well, and see, you went right into the answer. What I was going to say is just like, we don't have to tell you anything about buying property here. If I don't have a real estate license and I sell property, I'm a seller of a home, and you're a buyer and you come in and the contract says I'm buying it for XYZ and these are the terms within, and it doesn't specifically say I want a disclosure with respect to the condition of the property and things that happen here, you don't have to tell them anything.
That's a real gray area with realtors, though, because you have the whole provision in the real estate commission regs where it talks about that an agent should take necessary steps to determine the condition of a property for a potential buyer. And that's crazy if the buyer doesn't request through contract a seller's property disclosure.
2 reasons.
So what is the agent supposed to do? Is the agent supposed to go hire an inspector on their own and find out what the property? I mean, I don't think so, but that's a real gray area the way it's written in those regulations.
I don't ever want to testify in that situation. Just for the record, I'll testify in every other situation, but I do not want to be on this one because here's how I feel about that. And I'm kind of a gray area on this as well. And I couldn't stick to one side probably if I got nailed to it. So, and this is why. I think it is absolutely criminal for a seller to withhold material facts about a property that could affect the value and or the livability of the buyer once they engage with the property. For example, if you're weird about people dying in a house or committing suicide in a house or there being a murder there and there's a material fact associated with that, and it's going to affect your ability to buy the house. Like, I want to know that as a buyer. But like as a seller in the state, you don't have to tell me that.
But if you request it in a contract or other written document where you reach an agreement to get that information, then you're entitled to it by contract.
Well,
but if you don't ask for it, so in the standard realtor's form contract, when a realtor is involved, I'm guessing that 95% of all real estate contracts include the request for a seller's property disclosure.
I mean, I think I've seen 2 where there's not been a disclosure.
It's really not as much of an issue when an agent is involved. The only time it becomes an issue is when someone lies on the seller's property disclosure.
Or for sale by owners.
That's not legal if it's not requested, we're a non-disclosure state. But where I see it come up is when you have people that are doing purchasers agreements or owner finance contracts where they're buying it themselves, not using a real estate agent, and you get a lawyer to put together a contract. If somebody calls me and says, this is as is, I'm buying it as is, condition, whatever it may be, and that's what I'm told to put in a document, that's what we do. I mean, I'll recommend somebody, are you sure you don't want the right to do any inspection? You don't want the right to get any condition? Because I can type up something that asks.
Oh, no, I've heard the way that you I've heard the way that you approach.
Yeah,
you don't want a disclosure.
But if you don't ask for it in a contract when in that kind of situation, then you're not going to know all the facts, and there's no requirement. If you find out that half the house burned and was rebuilt, then you're just not going to know that. Or if you can't go back and blame somebody for it.
But that's the thing that gets me about it from a consumer standpoint is that like a for sale by owner, for instance, does not have to disclose anything they don't want to disclose. And so even as a buyer's agent, I go in, I'm representing my buyer. This happened with an agent who now like went through the process, bought his own house as one of my agents and kind of has built a business since then. Just always, I mean, he's great. But the point is when he was going through his own property, we were doing for sale by owner, and the owner didn't have to do a disclosure if he didn't want to. And that's kind of what struck me as like, whew, we requested one, he obliged, but technically he could have said no. He could have countered the deal and been like, I'm not going to give you disclosure.
And if he does, then you can choose whether you want to go forward or not.
Well, I can tell you what, he did disclose some random things before we closed too. Like it was just so random. He's like, I took a bath in here last night. what? Like, you didn't have to tell us that, sir, but like, it was one of those stories of like,
You're like, did you clean up?
And it's like, this is why we started the podcast. People are weird, like, and they do some crazy things in the real estate industry. But for the record, when you're moving to Arkansas, buying property in Arkansas, we are a non-disclosure state. However, you are most likely and should be working with an excellent real estate professional who will provide you the necessary documentation
I
to
think
properly disclose.
You can correct me if I'm wrong, but the transactions that I've been involved in myself and on behalf of other clients that have been buying property, especially residential property, is that the listing agent will have their client fill out a seller's property disclosure before any contract ever requires it. And so when you go look at the property, you can request a copy of the seller's property disclosure, and it's already been filled out. So in that instance, they're not even contractually obligated to do it at that point, and they have. Now, they may be contractually obligated in their listing agreement with their agent to fully disclose the condition of the property to the agent so the agent can properly market it. I think that's a small part of the listing agreement, but the seller's property disclosure is not part of that listing agreement. But most agents I see are getting them to fill it out before there's ever a contract in place.
Well, and big shout out to the agents who upload them on Carmel's. It's my favorite. Whenever I'm like, oh, associated documents, there's a disclosure. Here's all the things that happened. It makes it so much easier to show the property. You walk in and you're like, well, in 2008, there was a flood, or whatever happened. You at least have instance of it.
Exactly.
Now, I've seen it go both ways too. I had one we did this one together where there was a big mess at one of these properties.
We talked about it on our Halloween episode.
Yes, dun dun dun. That was when we were dressed as beer and pizza. I saw those pictures the other day. But when we were in the house, I was sitting there thinking like, I don't know if this is going to sell when we put all these details in there, but this market sure yields to a buyer, So put it out there and we had full disclosure details.
Oh, I remember I reviewed it.
And it was absolutely, it sold for full price. Everything closed.
To somebody that wanted to live there, right?
Well,
or was it an investor?
She actually put her like family member in there. So I don't know if she disclosed to her family member, like, P.S. here's how it happened, but she'll probably see the podcast someday. So sorry about that.
I don't think we gave the property address, but
well, I mean, someday, but
hey, let's face it, probably half the houses out there have had somebody die in them one
listen,
way or another.
I was literally about to say the statistic is that 50% of all properties, somebody has died inside of anyway. So if it's not a murder, if it's not a suicide, somebody died naturally in that house anyway. So just make sure that you are living in the house with good energy. Make sure
be nice to the ghosts.
Yeah, just be nice to them. Sage it up, put your crystals out. It's all good. But moving from non-disclosure into what is a buyer's right? I always thought that Arkansas had the most incredible rules when it came to buyers because they feel automatically protected. And I'll let you kind of go into the fancy lawyer verbiage about how this is written in the contract. But essentially, when you get to Arkansas and you're a buyer and you're represented by a real estate agent, and they are yours, not dual, but they're your agent specifically, they're not only your fiduciary, but you as a buyer have automatic rights built into the contract. So I'm going under contract on a property I haven't seen before, and I'm in the state of Arkansas. I haven't visited yet, okay? But I'm in California, and I wire the earnest money, which I know you love, and I send in my contract, and I'm under contract. In the first 10 days, tell me what my rights are.
Well, first off, I don't mind if you wire money as long as you do it with a legitimate title company that's local and licensed.
You just don't want me to use an earnest money addendum because it's your favorite document in the whole world?
Earnest money, no, I don't like that. But if you're going to wire something, wire it to somebody legitimate.
That's one of those documents that just adds paper to the pile. But anyway.
First 10 days, you have a right to the seller's disclosure if you've requested one so that you can view it. If you're not satisfied with it, you can get out, terminate, get your earnest money back if you stupidly put any in, because then you may be fighting over it. The other option you've got is the inspection period during that 10 days where you can hire a third party to go in and do an inspection. There are definitely good inspection companies and there are bad inspection companies. You need to get a good one.
And there's not that big of a punishment when they totally screw up.
Yes.
So.
And the law in Arkansas that's been passed and been approved is that a statute of limitations to go after a home inspector for missing something that they should have otherwise found is a year.
Yeah.
Most people don't even realize they have a problem with their brand new house that they love and bought and everything's all rosy and flowery until after a year. And then that opportunity is gone.
Well, two things just real quickly. First of all, nobody ever bought a new construction where the yard was ever flowery or rosy. Definitely some crappy saw at the last minute.
Yep.
But secondly,
you have the right. I mean, you have the right throughout with your financing contingency where if you're getting any financing and it actually says on terms acceptable to you, financing. So you could be approved for financing, but if they give you a 10% interest rate, that doesn't mean you have to close. If those terms are not acceptable to you, then you can terminate for a lack of financing. You just have to give some reasonable effort to obtain financing if that's a contingency. Other than that, within the first 10 days, I think that's close to it. You obviously have a right to come view the property yourself if you want to during the inspection process. And if you're an out-of-state buyer, I actually drafted a waiver for somebody this week because I think there have now been 3 suits in the last year and a half that have been filed that I'm aware of against agents where people that are viewing property remotely have turned around and sued agents saying you didn't show me this on the video camera walkthrough that you did. And so I've drafted a waiver for one agent in particular this week where to even show something via FaceTime or Zoom or whatever it is, they're making people sign off on a waiver says you're not coming back after me if I miss something in a video that would have been important to you, but you're not here to see it because I don't know that some kind of paint color is wrong on a ceiling that I didn't show you.
Well, that's going to open up a whole
or there was
can
a
of
whole,
worms.
Or outside the front door, there's a lot more freeway noise than I thought there was going to be. You can't hear that over a FaceTime call. And that person that's the agent may live right next to the freeway and not think anything about it being abnormal. So those things that would be important to you from a sensory standpoint, you can't feel those things over FaceTime.
You're so excited because I'm going to say it. External obsolescence can't be measured on a video unless you turn. But here's the thing. You just opened up a whole can of worms though too, because you remote buyers, this is something you need to know is that like the principles of a property when it comes down to like where the property sits, how it sits, what area of town it's in, all of these things, if you do not investigate them yourself, do not make your agent responsible for that. And I appreciate that you're drafting waivers because you have no idea unless you're standing in front of the property in actuality how you feel about the property. So I personally think when you're buying sight unseen, unless you're just trying to get a tax write-off by spending your money in another state on property, which is irresponsible, unless you're doing that, you should be viewing the property in person and seeing what's going on with it. Nobody is at fault but you, buyer.
Yeah, one of these buyers in one of these cases, I think it's the oldest one, it may actually have gotten dismissed now, was one of those buyers we talked about that comes in from out of state, sight unseen, waives right to inspection, waives disclosure, waives any appraisal.
Probably has an appraisal waiver,
waives appraisal waiver, and then turns around and files suit against the agent for not showing something at the property during the video walkthrough. And I'm going, you didn't even have a home inspection done, rather yet anything else, to determine if there were any issues with the property.
And this is something that's just absolutely outright avoidable because my point about bringing up the buyer automatic rights is that I thought it was such a way, I've told people on the phone, like literally use the verbiage to out-of-state buyers, like you are in a great situation as a buyer in the state of Arkansas because you go under contract and then you truly investigate. You have somebody up in there doing a home inspection. You actually look at the property. You have the financing piece that you talked about. You have the ability to terminate at any time related to those eitms.
Well, and even outside of the 10-day inspection period, you have a right to re-inspect later. Mm-hmm. So you can have an inspection, identify problems, tell the buyer, I either want these repaired or I want a credit. And then before you close, you have a final form that allows you to go back and re-inspect to determine whether the things that you wanted repaired had been adequately addressed. And if they aren't, you can get out at that point before closing.
You know, the URSA, which you're referring to, the Inspection Repair Survey Addendum that we so lovingly refer to as URSA. The reason that I hate that form is the same reason I hated that lady in The Little Mermaid, Ursula. And that's who I think of when I think of that form because it's just like all these tentacles of like, well, I want this. Well, I want that. Did you sign this in 3 days? Better make it 5.
Oh, it creates some problems, but it creates protection.
Yeah, too. I hate that form. Transaction coordinators everywhere.
The other thing about
got
the inspection,
their jobs because of the URSA. You're welcome.
The other protection you have in the inspection is that it doesn't restrict you to a home inspector only. It allows you to bring in any third party of your choosing to do an inspection. You can bring in a mold company. You can bring in a structural engineer. You can bring in, you can bring in any other kind of engineer if you want to. You can bring in someone for the roof. You can bring in somebody to check the fireplace. If you have a swimming pool in the back, you can bring in somebody to check the status of your swimming pool.
You can bring your lawyer.
All those things. Yeah.
Yeah,
you can bring your lawyer if you feel like it. I've never been asked to go on a home inspection before. But
it's interesting. I actually met somebody over at a property recently, and it was like a divorce case, right? And an attorney around town called me, and he was like, "Hey, I heard you did some expert testimony. Do you also handle like, you know, property valuations for nasty divorces?" I'm like, I'm game. So I go over there, and the worst possible scenario, the one spouse is home and the other one arrives like at the house. And what is she doing here? She's going to give us an opinion. Oh God, you guys are not supposed to be here at the same time. But point is, I go in there and I'm like looking at this property and I'm hearing them talk about structural issues and this stuff. And I start looking at it and I'm just like, oh, this is my specialty. Everyone's fighting and I have all the facts. Yeah. So it was one of those things where I really like to go. And I would have brought, the attorney was there, the sellers were there. So I could see where you could get called into a situation like that. But all goes back to the fact that the buyer has absolutely no reason, in my opinion, to be unreasonable about the first 10 days of a contract in the state of Arkansas, because you are protected from essentially everything, and you get to investigate this property for 10 full days. And the seller could hold you back and say like, oh, I don't want you to do that kind of inspection. Well, clearly they have something to hide. Yeah. Or you're in a situation where you can terminate, and there's absolutely no fiduciary issue with that. There's no money that you have to put down to get under contract. If they require you to do earnest money, you can get it back in that time period, as you know. So yeah, I feel like there's automatic protections built in for buyers.
True.
Even though selling agents represent them.
Yes.
Which brings me to two other things. We're going to go into dual agency just for one quick second, and only because I know we've covered this before, but I think it's important just because now that I've watched more and more agents, specifically my own, get into dual agency situations. And another thing you need to know as a buyer, though, is if you are coming to the state of Arkansas and you're represented by an agent, that agent may also legally represent the seller. Am I right?
Yes.
What's involved with that?
Disclosure of that relationship, number one.
I just thought about the typo.
Yeah, I did. And secondly, I think the real estate regulations set out the requirements of a dual agent better than anything else do. The real estate regulations in Arkansas talk about what the duties of a dual agent are. And, the simple fact is that they're required to an exchange of all information except for information which could impact the financial side of the deal from the standpoint of, I'm going to tell you what my client is willing to offer.
But can we just
what the high end is? Or my client is a doctor that makes $5 million a year, so he'd probably take less for this property than what you would think. That kind of thing is what you can't disclose. But as far as property condition, those kinds of things, all of that is subject to disclosure.
But can we submit that it's kind of difficult to represent the seller who wants the highest price and the buyer who wants the lowest price and have both of their best interests in mind?
It's doable, but it's difficult.
That's all I'm saying, is it's difficult. And I think what most people miss in dual agency, because I've had enough experience with it, like it takes experience, I will say, first of all, because not only are you kind of tiptoeing through the whole part you're talking about, where you're not giving enough, you can't give away too much, but you're also negotiating. You're not in a situation where you're like, okay, everybody agrees on the price every time. Sometimes it'll happen off market. Somebody will come and, hey, I found this house. My neighbor's going to sell his house. We need an agent to represent us. You're a best friend. Can you do that? Sure. They already agreed on all the terms. They live across the street from each other. They know how the house functions. That's an easy deal. Yeah. Doesn't normally happen like that. Usually out-of-state buyer contacts listing agent. Listing agent's like, heck yeah, I'm going to get both sides. And then they start trying to make this deal work. The danger in that is when you try to make the deal work and you're not keeping the top of mind your fiduciary responsibility to individual parties, which is why the Real Estate Commission and the ARA have provided us with such a beautiful form, the dual agency disclosure.
And it is a fact that the agent stands to gain from a deal getting done. Mm-hmm. The agent gets a commission only if the deal gets done.
Yep.
So the agent has an incentive. In most cases, it's difficult to get by the bias when you're representing both sides of talking one party into something that would get the deal done.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I can say the best experience I ever had with dual agency, and I since then have not done dual agency, even on the messy Halloween house, and mostly because I take I take the expert testimony and what we do on I Hate Real Estate very seriously, because I want other agents who are breaking in the market who maybe don't have a lot of this information to be able to look to us and go, okay, let's be reasonable. This is what we should be doing. Dual agency is something that on the commercial side has been very beneficial for me, because most commercial deals are based in numbers and fact. They're not based in like a marketable home in a neighborhood where you can walk your dog to the school where your kid goes to. I mean, these are different intrinsic motivators for buyers on the residential side than it is on the commercial side. Like these guys are just like, I need a triple net lease. This is my internal rate of return that I'm after. They aren't so much locationally concerned and all of the emotions that come with residential real estate. So in the past, I have negotiated where, hey, I'll be the agent on both sides. Here's what he wants. Here's what you have. Someone cut me this in the middle. I don't care who, and I'll handle this. And you've helped me with those kind of deals. Yeah. So it can be done. And especially in investment, I don't think that there's anything wrong with being a dual agent. I just think you have to be very careful with what your motives are in the deal, because you're going to make money on both sides, but are you going to be able to sell behind yourself to both of these individuals down the road? Anyway, sometimes I say it well.
Yeah. I mean, dual agency is difficult. There's two situations in the law that feel similar, but they're not exactly the same. One of them is when you're trying to settle a case, because ultimately the ethics codes in Arkansas governing lawyers say that the lawyer can give advice as to settlement negotiations, but the ultimate decision as to settlement lies with the client exclusively. If I tell a client, no, you should offer $50,000, and the client says, no, I want $5 million, then I don't have the option but to offer $5 million.
Yeah, which brings us back also to unrealistic sellers.
Yeah. And then and so really you're stuck in the middle where all you can do is advise someone on something, having information about, because in all likelihood I've talked to the lawyer on the other side. We know kind of where everything's at, and all I can do is give advice. The ultimate decision is with the client, and it feels that way in dual agency. It's kind of like you have to be hands off, but not be hands off in what these ultimate decisions are that bring two people together.
Yeah.
And then the other one is if I represent an estate in a probate case and the heirs are fighting with each other, I can't represent the heirs that are fighting with each other. I have to take an independent position. So I walk into a courtroom if there's a dispute, and the judge looks at me and says, well, Mr. Grooms, what are the estate's thoughts? And I said, Judge, you just tell me what to do at the end of this. I mean, it's the same type of thing. You're just stuck in the middle of two people, and you're having to be very careful because you can't advocate for one side or another. And if you do, you have to have a justifiable basis to do it under the law. And that's close to this, but it's still not the same. This is more, dual agency in real estate is more difficult than either of those situations.
Yes. And I feel like, I mean, not only do I agree with that, but it also comes down to like, sometimes that's the most frustrating part about dual agency is that when you know the situation and you know how to handle it and the clients won't cooperate, or they don't see your side of it, or they don't know how to negotiate effectively through you. And then you're in a situation where you're like, I just wish that I could tell this guy, this is how we make the deal work, but I can't because I have a fiduciary responsibility to the guy on the other side. So I recommend from my personal standpoint, never to do dual agency in residential situations when it's avoidable, but instead to put an agent in there who is someone who will cooperate with you, maybe someone in your own brokerage, someone on your team, but somebody who can have individual representation of the client to protect both parties from any sort of
and the best solution that I've seen to this is what you just said, and you do this all the time, is that even if you have a buyer and a seller that are interested in the same property, they can hire your agency, but you assign separate agents to the deal, and you build what we call in the law, you build a Chinese wall in between it so that they don't discuss it. They don't have access to each other's files on it. They don't have communication about it. You communicate just like that agent. The two agents communicate just like they're working for different brokerages.
Yep.
And
that's where Coopertition comes back.
The brokerage still benefits as a whole from the transaction going through. Two agents at the same brokerage benefit from the transaction going through. And you have a dual agency, but you don't have the dual agency relationship.
Yes. So there's our advice on that. This is just full of great information. So if this is the first time you've ever watched I Hate Real Estate, you're welcome. Stay tuned. So two more. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm going off because I've got a whole list. But the other thing I want to talk about is we talked about buyer's rights, but a seller can't really terminate. Not when they really can't terminate. So can you just dive into that really quickly? Because it's my opinion anyways, unless I'm wrong. Once you engage in a real estate contract, specifically using the ARA forms here in Arkansas, you can't really terminate on the seller side. You can't say, I changed my mind, correct?
I mean, there's only a limited number of circumstances where you could.
What are those?
Well, I mean, most of those would be built into the other exceptions or other conditions portion of it, where if you had a contingency in where the seller was buying another house and their requirement to sell to you is Jamie's dying.
I'm sorry. Those are what my sneezes sound like. Sorry.
If your deal is contingent upon some other deal that they have, their backside deal closing, then you could have that kind of contingency where if that fell apart, then the seller would have the right to terminate.
Well, and the thing is, but technically that's a contingency in the contract. So like you said, it's still in the hands of the buyer, though, really, because the buyer of the previous property that's tied to the seller's property, you're talking about I'm talking about
the reverse. I've seen where a seller would be trying to get a new property.
Okay. And then their house doesn't sell or their contract comes apart.
Yeah, most times you have a buyer who's buying your house who's also selling the house they're moving from. That's the other side. I'm talking about the seller trying to move somewhere else, and you have a contingency. And then you get...
So they can only terminate, though, based on the fact they couldn't perform on their own contract.
That's what I'm saying. That's not a checkbox on the contract. Mm-mm. That's a scenario that has to be drafted into the other contingencies portion of the contract. I'm just trying to think of anything that would be out there.
I wonder even who would think of that in foresight. So it's like, who would even think of that in foresight? As a seller, I would have never thought to add that contingency to my contract if I didn't have an agent advise me to do so or an attorney.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about it is the reason I bring this up is that sellers technically have to perform on the contract no matter what. So once the buyer gets you under contract and the buyer gets past the due diligence period that we mentioned that's built into our contracts. Plus, you can check other boxes. You can be like, also, I get this.
I was trying to think if the URSA had anything in it that if the buyer didn't perform certain functions under the inspection or providing that document or any documentation, or if they didn't sign off on accepting the repairs after a certain amount of time, that the seller would have the right to terminate.
The URSA can save you on unreasonableness. Like what I've figured out is that the sellers can be like, oh, I'm not going to do anything at all. Like I'm not going to touch the repairs. I'm not going to give you a credit. And in that particular scenario, sometimes you'll piss off the buyer enough to terminate the contract, and or they don't want the property in that condition, so they'll walk away. However, the seller just can't outright, and this is the part that kind of blows my mind, because I think in other states it's handled differently. Depends on the state that you're in. Sellers can't just say, though, I changed my mind. I got a divorce and now I don't want to sell the house. My mom died and now I can't sell the house. Whatever. All those things, the seller cannot step in and say, I changed my mind. And that's a fact you just need to know.
There are only limited number of circumstances, very limited number of circumstances. Yeah. And most of those circumstances are contingent upon a buyer taking an action against its own interests in the contract. So as long as the buyer supports its own interests and proceeds with the transaction in good faith, there's really not a scenario that I can think of off the top of my head where a seller can terminate.
Yeah. So I wanted to make
I write those letters all the time.
See?
Where a seller shows up or doesn't show up to closing, just randomly sends the mutual termination form the day before closing and says, I've decided I don't want to sell now. Something fell apart on the other side that I was going to do, and now I'm not selling to you. I can't tell you how many of those letters that I've written in the last 10 years.
That happened to me once too, and that's one of the reasons why it's like I had a seller that did not show up for closing, and the buyer didn't ever sue him for specific performance. I would have.
Yeah, that causes so many problems on the buyer's side, because the buyer's incurred all these expenses of inspections and appraisals.
They're moving.
Financing is lined up. They've hired moving trucks to come in and get their stuff. In all likelihood, most of the moving trucks are already loaded. In some scenarios, they've already sold their house to somebody else. You get people that are on a delayed occupancy addendum where they have already actually closed and sold their house, and they have 5 days to get out.
That was literally what I was thinking.
What are you going to do? What are you going to do if a seller says, I'm not selling you the house? Yeah, specific performance is a great cause of action from a legal standpoint, but you're talking about 6 months.
Yes.
And what are you going to do in a 6 month period when you've already sold your house?
You're not going to rent an Airbnb because that would be expensive.
You're going to you're going to walk to your nearest apartment complexes with your 4 kids and all your stuff.
Tell you what I would do. I would call Campbell & Grooms. That's what I would do. I'd give me some good law representation.
I can't get you a house to live in.
Yeah, but you can. Yeah. But this is my point: is that if you're coming into this state and you buy property and then you turn around and you want to sell it, like just be aware that as well as we treat a buyer, we also protect a seller from I guess it's not protection so much as the seller has no ability to terminate in the contract once they submit themselves to the market and they go under contract on a property and they get past the 10 days. So that's why you do have such a robust opportunity as a buyer to investigate and get down into it and really know if you want to buy this property or not, because on the other side, they don't get a choice once you get past that period, or actually at all, even when you're in that period. So sellers, be aware. Last thing, and this one is just, this one's a little close to home because, getting married and divorced in the state of Arkansas is not an easy thing to do. Actually, it's easy to get married. It's hard to get divorced. But that being said, there's a property state rule here in Arkansas. And you won't be doing a buying and selling of any property without your dear old spouse. Because why?
Spouse has a right to at least a life interest in the property.
So you also can't buy it.
Regardless of who owns it.
You also can't buy it without having your wife's signature, your husband's signature when you're engaging in the financing piece, correct?
Correct. On the financing piece, yes.
Well, but here's the thing.
Because the finance, that's a lender dependent requirement, but most lenders in their mortgage are going to require the spouse's constitutional right to dower, and it's called the dower interest. They're going to require that to be waived as a part of their mortgage documents. Otherwise, the spouse has a first priority technically on the property over and above the mortgage company.
And so this is what happens. You get married in the state of Arkansas and you buy a piece of property, and or you live in a piece of property with somebody and then you get married. Either way, if you get married and you never paid for that house, never bought a house, never touched it, but you married that person, when you go to get divorced, you automatically have right to that property because it's a shared equity. It's a married
Or if
property
somebody
state.
dies.
Yeah, if somebody dies or whatever happens, the point is you have a right to that just because you're married to that person. So it's one of those things, unless you outline it in a prenuptial agreement, right?
Yep.
I'm like guessing on this one.
No, it's true.
But then the next part is when you go to settle your property, let's say that you settle and you're like, okay, well, if you ever sell the house, you know, because this is what happened with the seller that didn't show in my scenario. The truth of the matter is that like the title company went through and found, and we've covered this on that episode in detail, but point is they found a property settlement agreement, and it had alluded to the fact that at the time they settled, they were in agreement that if the house ever sold, they would split the proceeds, okay? But like 6 or 8 or 9 years had gone by since this thing was done, and so like he goes to sell it and doesn't even consider like that whole agreement they made because he's
been the one managing it, renting it
living
to people.
there. Yeah, no, he lives there. It's like a principal residence.
There was one we had where somebody was renting it too.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Yeah. But in this particular situation, he's like, okay, I'm going to sell the house. And we get it all worked out. And we're like 2-3 days before closing, which, you know, there were some mistakes made there on the back end. Not by me. But the point is, not this time. Point is, they go and give this wife a quitclaim deed. They're like, go ahead and sign this because your ex-husband is selling the house and there's all this money involved. And she's like, I'm not signing that. Where's my share?
Yeah. Show me the closing statement of what I'm getting.
But he doesn't want to do it if she's going to get her half. And so that's how it happens is he ends up figuring out that he needs her signature. He can't even sell the property without her signature because an associated property settlement agreement from a separate divorce decree and property settlement in the court has brought into question 6.5 years, 8 years later that he cannot sell his house without making sure that she gets her half of it. And so it's like one of those things in the state of Arkansas, you better have an ironclad prenup or you better understand if you get into a property arrangement with somebody while you're married, you're going to deal with it again when you get divorced.
I've never seen a property settlement agreement arising out of a divorce case in particular where it was not ordered that regardless of if husband took the property, if wife took the property, or if they agreed we're going to hold it and sell it just like this scenario, that there's not also a requirement that within a certain amount of time or at a certain point in it, the person who is not getting the property sign over a quitclaim deed because they have to sign over their interest. You do not have good title to property as an ex-spouse without it.
It's just one of those things that you don't even think about too when you're going through it because you're doing all these things and you don't even think about it and you settle on who gets the property. Yep. But it's that key right there that you're talking about. It's you get automatic equity when you get married in the state of Arkansas. Okay, so if you really like that cattle farmer that you're dating, you know, and you get married to him, you better know that half that cattle farm is yours, or maybe not half, but there's going to be some equitable interest to divide up when you know.
There's laws that may impact there that it was premarital property if it ever got divided in a divorce, but you better make the assumption.
Well, I'll tell you what though, if you spend like 20 years married to some dude in the state of Arkansas and it's not like a fly-by-night situation, like the farmer's going to have a hard time.
Especially if the land wasn't paid off and you commingle money and start using that money to pay off the land or the farm or whatever it is, yes.
Or live in the house. You build equity in the house by living there and paying the mortgage every month.
That's what I'm saying. If there's financing and you use commingled funds, it becomes a problem for...
That surprises people in other states because other states don't have this rule automatically where you marry somebody and you get ownership in their property. And that's like one of the major benefits of marriage.
There's some community property states where that happens, kind of. It's still the same scenario that it can be non-marital property in some circumstances, but you should go into a marriage assuming that fact will occur.
Yeah, and make
sure the other side of it's in probate too. So where in probate in Arkansas, if a husband and wife own property together and one of them dies, it automatically goes to the other.
Well,
no probate's required. Nothing's necessary. You 100% own the property. You don't have to get anything else. But I see it all the time where a husband would own a property and the husband would pass away. Well, if the husband's name is the only one on it and that husband was married at the time of passing, then the wife has an interest in the property, but it's a restricted interest. It's a limited interest. But still, if the children end up with the actual remainder interest through the probate, because that's how Arkansas law passes it, prefers children over spouse, but the spouse still gets something. Those children can't sell the property. Because
without her
without the
signature.
spouse's signature on it, they cannot do it.
And there's situations too. I've had one like this where the wife ended up staying in the property after the husband died, and the kids wanted her like gone. They were like, we don't like you, and she did not want to sign off on the deed because she lived there and she didn't have the means to sell the property, get a new property. She didn't have the means to go out and get her own property, and the kids are just like, we don't care. We want to sell Dad's house and we want the money and we're gone, And I stayed out at that point. I was like, these are not my ideal clients.
They probably ended up not able to do it. I mean, they cannot sell it in Arkansas. It's constitutional, the right to homestead, and then it's statutory also under the probate code that you can't sell it. Without her signature.
It took me a lot of years to.
So they can sell it. They can sell their interest in the property
to her, or they could quit claim
they
it
can
to
sell
her.
it. They can sell it to me if they want to, but it's subject to
her approval.
No. They can
Well, she'd
sell
have
me,
to sign it, right?
Not if I bought their interest only.
Oh.
So if I bought their
you
interest
become the
only,
other co-owner.
if I bought their interest only, then I have to wait until she passes away. And when she passes away, I become the 100% owner.
That's actually a really smart business plan. You could literally go out and comb the trusts that are publicly filed and be like, hey, I just want you to know that I want to buy your interest in this property, because think about some of the properties that are always going to appreciate, properties in certain, they're always going to keep adding value.
Well,
like you can just go in and buy pieces
of trust. The beauty
of
to
trust.
that is there's a formula out there that says in a life estate, which is what that spouse gets, if this person is this age, here's the percentage allocation that Arkansas would give them as their valuation of the property. So if you're 60 years old, you get your life estate is worth X percentage of the fair market value of the property. And that number is higher than you would think it is.
Oh, I'm sure.
Because I looked at it the other day for a client that we have I think she's probably in her mid 70s. And it was like 45% of the fair market value of the property in the chart. I was shocked. I was like, this ought to be 15% or 20%. It was a lot higher than I thought.
That's pretty awesome for her, though. Yeah, it's interesting. And a married property estate is something I never really thought about. We didn't really talk about it a whole lot. Real estate school, truthfully, like, let's be honest, guys, they're teaching to the test.
We haven't talked about it very much on the podcast either.
No, and
we did a probate episode one time, but I don't think we got into all of that.
We'll get into married property estate down the road. I think we'll get some practice on that before, and then we'll go from there. We'll talk more about that. I have really only dealt with the ugly side of it. The seller not showing up to closing. I've dealt with the wife not signing the quitclaim deed. I've dealt with them fighting over property and property settlement issues. So I've never really seen a married property estate. Like when I'm talking about that rule, it's usually not good. It's usually like a bad situation that has brought it to light. So just be aware. And also selling, like on the day of selling, when you go to sell a property, you have to have their signature if you're married to them. So it's like on closing day, and there's been multiple times that this has happened with one of my busier clients who just never seems to be able to sit down for more than a few minutes. Coordinating his schedule with the wife when they would close was almost impossible. And she'd be like, why do I have to sign this? I don't care what he's doing with his real estate investments, because you're married. That's why. And you have to sign off on his bullshit. So that happens as well. You can't close without her, him, whoever. So I think we've gone through enough FAQs today. If you haven't practiced real estate and or bought or sold real estate in the state of Arkansas, you are now much more well-informed than you were when you started the beginning of the show.
I have a PSA before we quit.
Oh, and I also, go ahead.
We've been hired by a couple who own several rental properties, and we're working on a case for them. It'll be public soon, so it's not anything that's secretive. But they went to do a refinance. When you have multiple rental properties like that, you're not going to get 30-year traditional financing. You come up for refinance every so many years with your loan. And so they have these properties in groups where they only have to refinance one group of properties every so many years. Well, they could foresee that this particular group of properties was coming up for refinance, and so they started doing their typical due diligence with the bank of, hey, let's make sure that we're in a good position to get this refinance done when it comes up a year from now, something like that. The bank runs a search and says, hey, you have this random notice of adverse claim that's been filed against your property. You got to get rid of this thing. And they say, what is it? They're like, I don't know. It's pre-foreclosure, before y'all bought it at a foreclosure auction. It's some deal that's still out there. And so they go looking at it, and there is a guy in Arkansas here particularly who has gone around with multiple properties. We have found currently 15 to 20 deeds and other notices of adverse claims and all these other random notices that have been filed against properties, primarily that have been sold at a tax sale or sold at a foreclosure auction. And he's filed these, and it's created a cloud on the title. You can't sell it. You can't finance. You can't do anything as long as the cloud on title is there. And it's completely illegitimate. The guy lists his address as the post office in downtown Little Rock. Not a P.O. box, nothing, just the
physical post office.
Yes, return this to the post office. And that's what he's doing. And we found out that child support actually located him and served him with a document at some residence. So we think we know where he is. But all these documents have been filed. It's 600 East Capitol in Little Rock, Arkansas. It is the Main Street post office, the downtown post office in Little Rock. And he's filed all these. And there are a number of properties out there who have no idea that these exist that impact their property. And what he's trying to do, he doesn't understand the law. What he's trying to do is file these public.
He has taken the law in his own hands, actually, is what he's been doing.
I'm claiming that I have an adverse interest in your property. I'm going to wait 7 years, hope you don't find it, and then I'm going to file for adverse possession.
Because adverse possession in Arkansas only takes 7 years, and that's almost like if you squatted on a property.
But he doesn't know the law, because under the law, you also now have to have color of title to the property, meaning you have to have some document that indicates that you have an ownership interest, and he does not.
Some reason as to why.
And he has to have paid 7 years of property taxes before he can do it as well, and he has not paid the property taxes. So all he's done is go around and create an inconvenience for all these people.
And he paid money to do this.
It's criminal.
He would have had to pay money.
Oh, and the other thing is he puts one name on the document as the person who is receiving, who has the claim, and an alternate name that he goes by as the person that prepared the instrument. So it looks like two different people are involved, but it's actually the same person. So my PSA is, number one, I'll help anybody that gets in this condition or finds out about this. But if you are an investor out there, or you are an agent that helps an investor, people that go try to put together these property packages through foreclosure sales or tax sales, you better check your property, because it's happening. There's dozens of them out there on properties all around Little Rock and in Pulaski County. I don't know if there's others in other counties in Arkansas. This particular person, I'm not going to go into detail on it because we haven't filed what we've done. This particular person is part of a group of people that is it's a consolidated group of people that have various religious backgrounds and other things that they believe in. They're all over the country. They're very likely doing this everywhere if it's some plan that they've come up with to try to acquire the property. There's all these things out there about we need to enforce our constitutional rights. Let's go do these things. So I don't know how widespread it is, but here there's, dozens of them that have been filed against properties.
Well, first of all, thanks for always protecting our listeners and the public with your amazing lawyer skills. You need a cape. But secondly, what a bunch of garbage. This guy's actually spending money, time, and effort. Like, he's spending his day trying to ruin the situation.
He's a piece of work.
Yeah, I'm going to beat this guy up. I'm just kidding. But here's the thing. If you are out there, that's the other thing that you mentioned when you talked about if you're an agent or if you're a broker, if you're a real estate instructor, like, that's important information to understand. And also, adverse possession is a weird rule that we need to go ahead and get some diving into on. So I'll definitely earmark that for another episode, because basically if I sleep on your property and pay your taxes for 7 years, it could be mine outright for not buying it. So it's an interesting, I might consider moving to a cabin for 7 years to see if I can get it, but anyways, so quick facts before we go as well. If you haven't invested in the Little Rock or Central Arkansas area, something to know about us is we have one of the lowest median home prices in the country. We are literally situated at the largest area of transit in the entire country, with 30 and 40 intersecting. In our city, we have a ton of exciting things going on. We're training 75% of healthcare practitioners across the nation. We have the largest global financial technology accelerator. We have huge startup companies that are coming out of here. And so I say this to say that we are a great place to get information related to investing and buying
just
property.
Just about every employer here is looking for people to work.
Yeah, and the Great Resignation, go ahead and resign yourself to loving Arkansas, because we're in a situation where not only do you have walkable communities, you have the ability to afford the property that you live in, but you have very competitive, nice, good-paying jobs and great professional people to work with. There's access in our city to resources you can't find when you live in a big city.
We have a lot of people moving here from Western United States right now.
Mm-hmm, a lot, and Eastern United States too. And so there's a reason why. And so if you have not investigated Arkansas to a proper level, I would have you reach out to us here on I Say Real Estate, and we can help you buy the property, make your dreams come true in Central Arkansas. Plus, you'll get to hang out with cool people like
place to live,
Kendall and I. Right, I know. They have, the greatest podcast in all the land is recorded here in Little Rock, Arkansas. So
we'll let you come watch. We'll rent a studio.
Yeah, we'll rent a studio. So I'll let you rule the day and go ahead and just be proud of yourself, Kendall, because you know all the laws and the rules. So it's great. The ruling is, though, that it is absolutely a wonderful place to live and to buy property. So might hate real estate, but I love Arkansas.
That's right. That's it.
Woo pig.